Welcome to the Into AI Safety podcast, where we discuss the challenges facing the field of AI safety and those who work within it. This show aims to provide the foundation and resources needed to get up to speed on safe and ethical AI. As always, I am your host, Jacob Hames. During the podcast, you may hear this sound, which denotes that I have included at least one link related to the content that preceded the sound. The purpose of this is to allow for citations and providing resources without breaking the flow of conversations. As per usual, items mentioned during asides will have links in the show notes as well. This interview was recorded on February 3rd, 2026, and asides were recorded on March 2nd, 2026. How many AI researchers can say that they got their start in animal welfare? Well, I didn't really crunch the numbers on this, but it is at least one. Today's guest is a researcher at Stanford, co-founder of Sentience Institute, a nonprofit focused on moral circle expansion, author of The End of Animal Farming, has been featured in various news outlets including The Hill and The Guardian, was recognized as one of Vice's Humans of the Year in 2017, is the first co-author I've gotten to have on the podcast after I worked with them, and perhaps most importantly, is the first guest who has their very own Wikipedia page. His recent works cover a wide range of topics, including understanding human perception of AI systems, evaluating how supportive language models are of human agency, the impossibility of fair LLMs, and much more. But he began his academic career focused on questions of animal welfare. We cover his unconventional trajectory, which actually ends up being much more cohesive than it initially sounds, the impact of anthropomorphization on AI and how we interact with those systems, what sentience is, or at least how we can begin to think about it, and whether or not, and under what conditions, we as researchers can leverage large language models to aid in social science research. Before we get into it, as part of my ongoing effort to make this whole podcasting thing a bit more sustainable, there will be a Patreon-only edit which includes some extra content, so head on over there and give it a listen if you're interested. With that, I'm excited to introduce Jacy Reese-Anthis.
Yeah, I'm Jacy Reese-Anthis. I'm a full-time researcher at Stanford University in computer science.
What are you trying to figure out with your research?
I'm aiming with all sorts of different methods to help humanity navigate the emergence of digital minds.
So tell me a bit about how you ended up where you are now. What were some of the more substantial things that informed your trajectory, and how have you ended up in this space? And then what is it that you're doing now?
Yeah, my undergraduate degree was in neuroscience, so I was very interested in understanding the human mind, but especially the minds of non-human entities, including animals as well as emergent artificial intelligences. I was thinking a lot about career choice at the end of my degree, went through this effective altruism cycle of where you think about global poverty issues and animal welfare issues and artificial intelligence issues and kind of rotate through them, but I knew I had to make at least a tentative decision. So I ended up focusing on animal welfare. I got a job at Animal Charity Evaluators and then co-founded the Sentience Institute, where I continue to do research today. And Sentience Institute was focused on animal advocacy, in particular this phenomenon of moral circle expansion. How do we come to understand and get to know and care for new non-human entities in this case? It could be other human groups that our circles are expanding towards. And then for artificial intelligence, I was very interested in that throughout that period. But once my book had come out, The End of Animal Farming, I felt like that was a good culmination of my work on farmed animal advocacy, which is a giant group of non-human entities. And then we were seeing this deep learning revolution and this emergence of a new group of non-human entities in society. So that's what I've been focused on since then.
And so that the book came out in 2018, I believe?
Yes.
So that's actually like when that started to occur. So pretty early on, relatively, in the boom, I guess, that we're currently in.
Yeah, I think in 2014, I was focused on, we had a few different names for it, but like long-term animal advocacy, or long-termist animal advocacy eventually. So this idea of this moral circle mattering for domestic animals today, like dogs and cats in our homes, farmed animals, but also expanding towards wild animals and then eventually expanding towards artificial intelligence or what sort of digital sentience might exist in the future. So I was focused on thinking about AI throughout that time. The book, for example, concludes by talking about digital minds. And around 2018, when the book came out, I was going to actually transition like the explicit focus of my work into that area. I didn't know a lot about the technical side of AI. If I did, I might have planned things a little differently. Like I didn't actually know, I think, what a deep learning revolution was. But I knew that AI was important and it was going to take off within my lifetime. So it
Hmm.
made sense to focus on it.
Can you connect how you were like, okay, animal welfare into digital minds?
Yeah, so there's a long history of this moral circle as the idea of starting from our friends and family and extending to people in our city, to people in our country, to people around the world. And then, at least within the past couple of centuries, there's been discourse about animal rights and expanding it to non-human entities, as well as some people who want to expand it to environmental entities, for example.
Hmm.
But my motivation was kind of ultimately I want to create the greatest happiness for the greatest number of sentient beings, and domestic animals in the food system are over 100 billion. They're just a huge group of suffering entities who not many people are helping. So
Hmm.
it made sense for that kind of cost prioritization reason. And then I think the same argument extends to wild animals. The wild number of wild animals dwarfs the number of farmed animals. And
Hmm.
then it extends a step further to digital minds, or in general, future minds. I expect just in the far future, most of the minds to exist in the universe to be digital. So really just focused on that huge number as we get, exponential population growth, as we expand to the stars, as we get artificial general intelligence, that being just a very morally important group of non-human entities to focus on.
So really like the more long-termist perspective there. We'll get into that in a little bit. But before we go further, I guess the other thing that I'm curious about is you've done a lot of work in very distinct areas within the AI space. So like there's been some evaluations work. You've done a survey on like AI companions. You've worked with like social simulation and using language models for that. Like what unifies these in your eyes?
Yeah, and then there's another big area which is fairness research and more mathematical,
Yes.
proofs of what it means for an algorithm to be fair. My broad interest there is socio-technical AI safety, so kind of taking this interdisciplinary lens to what have traditionally been approached as issues of hard and fast, technical control, especially in the 2010s of AI safety, but
Mm-hmm.
still now, this
Mm.
idea that we need to like go into the system, it's gonna mesa optimize, it's going to optimize in some way that we don't expect and we should control for that. And rather seeing it as like, well, what values do we want to align AI with? How could that go wrong in a political system as
Mm-hmm.
we get, very weird AIs as we're starting to get today with this jagged frontier of capabilities? What sort of social dynamics do we have to navigate? As well as, eventually things like algorithmic fairness, I think are important for distributing resources kind of throughout whatever large scale society we see in the future. And also as a sandbox, we've done more to mathematically formalize fairness than any other area. So if
Mm.
you want to understand how we answer a question like what values do we want to optimize AI for, then starting in fairness makes a lot of sense. Fairness has this nice equal sign. You get to make like a conditional equality between two different areas. You say they're going to be treated the same. Tons of different ways to formalize that, but that makes it very natural as a mathematical object.
So taking a step back, I want to focus on Sentience Institute, which you began with your now wife, I believe, in 2017. So this is shortly before you publish your book. What's your goal here? Why did you do this?
Yeah, so I was working at Animal Charity Evaluators as a researcher, so doing nonprofit research to evaluate the effectiveness of particular organizations. I started with Animal Charity Evaluators around 2013 as a volunteer. I was on their board of directors before I finished my undergraduate degree, and then as a full-time researcher. And ACE had gotten off the ground in many ways, so we did a lot of the foundational research. I think like in broad strokes, you could tell a similar story with global poverty charities and like the discovery of malaria nets and deworming pills as really effective interventions.
Mm-hmm.
We'd sort of done that work in charity evaluation for animals. So I felt like it was time to move to something else. I had been talking to some editors at media outlets, like the Huffington Post was actually where I got my start, but then writing for Vox and other places, and then talking to literary agents and book editors about the possibility of doing a book. So just
Mm-hmm.
there were several things that led me to want to kind of start a new area or a new organization in some way and have more on the ground impact, like I enjoyed doing so much at Animal Charity Evaluators. So
Hmm.
then it was actually the Effective Altruism Foundation, this group based in Switzerland and Germany, who contacted us, and we were interested in their group called Sentience Politics. They wanted to spin that off from the organization. We said, okay, Sentience Politics, well, we'll take the research side of that and call it Sentience Institute and do research on, again, moral circle expansion broadly, but especially focused on animals for now. They gave us our seed funding. Kelly, my wife, was the executive director of the organization, so she set it up, did a lot of that initial branding, the website, setting our direction as an organization. And then I was doing the research side of it, and as it transitioned into AI stuff, that was just sort of natural, continuing our work on moral circle expansion.
And like I guess building off of the Sentience Institute like naming and you just mentioned digital minds and sort of talking about those claims. I guess another thing that I think about when we get towards what I would say this is like anthropomorphic personifying language, and this is also a pattern. In the writing of researchers, people say things like, they appear to have reasoning, emotion, agency, and other mental faculties, or, mind-like, and there's no commitment to that from like the researcher's perspective. But then those are taken sort of out of context and used as fodder for sensationalist pieces, or just like seen by other people that sort of say, oh, they sentience and AI were in the same sentence. That's good enough for me.
Yeah, this is really interesting because we live in this age of virality where just the term
Right.
you pick for something or the quote you share can drive so much of at least public engagement. A couple angles on it. So one, the historical angle. So when we started focusing on digital minds or digital sentience, there wasn't as much of a concern about sensationalism around AI. There was some concern about hype. In 2016, like Microsoft switched their research branding to artificial intelligence. You had systems like AlphaGo and things that were seen as potentially being exaggerated as so superhuman and they're going to revolutionize every field when they were relatively narrow and it became like
Mm-hmm.
a corporate branding strategy. But that wasn't a concern about anthropomorphism. I mean, there
Mm-hmm.
have been concerns about anthropomorphism since the 50s. We have like the Eliza effect that people talked about with the world's first chatbot. We've had Ben Shireman and human computer interaction critiquing the use of first person language by computers, like bank teller machines that were automated and would use the term I. They've
Mm-hmm.
disliked that. I mean, kind of the ship has sailed with large language models and first person language, for better or
Yeah.
worse.
The Eliza effect is a reference to what has since been recognized as the first chatbot, Eliza, which was created by Joseph Weizenbaum and published with his 1966 paper Eliza, a computer program for the study of natural language communication between man and machine. While Weizenbaum's intent was to further the field of NLP, or natural language processing, he found that in some cases it was quite difficult to convince test subjects that the system was not actually a person. The phenomenon has since been generalized into the Eliza effect. That is, when humans project human like qualities, such as understanding or consciousness, onto a computer system based solely on their outputs. After releasing Eliza, Weizenbaum then spent the remainder of his life attempting to warn others of the dangers of using AI systems for arbitrary use cases. And he was particularly appalled at the idea that Eliza could be used for therapy. In addition, he was outspoken against MIT's involvement in the military industrial complex, especially during the Vietnam War, and the use of AI for mass surveillance. Honestly, he kinda sounds like a baller. When asked later in life what paper he felt was the most important in AI within the last 50 years, he chose Drew McDermott's 1976 paper, Artificial Intelligence Meets Natural Stupidity, which is a great read and is still just as poignant today as it was when first published, if not more so. Among other things, McDermott was critiquing the use of aspirational and sensationalistic language within the AI space, which is still a problem today. Also, I'll clarify that the second reference Jacy makes is to Ben Schneiderman, author of the 2022 book Human-Centered AI, whose takes I generally think are quite good.
But now we see those as like more of concerns, and that's one reason to now focus more on not just under attribution. So we develop conscious AI, they matter, we're all really cruel to them because we don't recognize their sentience, but also the risks of over attribution, sensationalism. People think that it's more than it is, or people even divert resources away from truly sentient beings and towards inanimate machines in some way. So these are all important considerations, I think, in terms of how I see my role. I think that that sort of measured language, I try to take discussions that are already in a relatively anthropomorphic direction and make them more measured, more so than take the discussion and shift it in an anthropomorphic direction. One thing we talked about when we were doing like a community call for people who were like leading organizations and leading researchers focused on digital minds was we kind of, this was maybe in 2023, we wanted to make sure when digital minds were discussed, they were discussed in a better way, but we didn't want people going out and just increasing the focus on digital minds. However, you get very challenging tensions there because not everyone plays ball, plays cooperatively with that. People
Yeah.
defect, or even just people outside of the community will exaggerate things or at least like anthropomorphize in some way. I mean, the most famous example is all the discourse around Blake Lemoine, who was a Google engineer who left because he claimed that Lambda, their chatbot, was sentient. Wrote a bunch about this, got very widely covered, is still discussed a ton to this day, and has been an example where somebody just kind of was the first one to do it.
Sorry to jump in again so soon, but this one also requires its own context. Blake was a member of Google's responsible AI team and was working with Lambda, or Language Model for Dialogue Applications, in 2022 when he claimed that the system was sentient. To help contextualize this system, it was essentially the predecessor to Bard, which itself was the predecessor to Gemini, and was roughly equivalent to the original ChatGPT in terms of capabilities at that point in time. After raising his concerns internally, he was put on paid leave and so decided to go public with his revelation, but it didn't have the reception he was likely expecting. As one of my personal favorite researchers, Meg Mitchell, put it, quote, "It's been known for forever that humans are predisposed to anthropomorphize even with only the shallowest of signals. Google engineers are human too, and not immune," end quote. Blake was fired the following month, and thanks to Timnit Gebru's exit just a little bit before that, which had also been quite the media storm, Blake's got a decent amount of coverage.
You know, other people have been thinking about these things for a long time in academia, but this was somebody at Google. Timnit Gebru and other people had like left Google in dramatic ways, so there was kind of a journalistic appetite for, you know, leaving big tech or something. And I think ultimately, you know, Blake's a very well-intentioned person, but that has been net harmful in my opinion because it sort of fired too early, and it did that anthropomorphism, and it was clear at the time that the systems weren't living up to everything that they were being spoken for. So like the mirroring was just such an obvious explanation. They're language models, they're trained on human text, they're going to talk and say that they're sentient, regardless of what their actual sentience is. The discourse has evolved quite a bit, and the systems are more complex and people are more appreciative of that fact. But that's the sort of tension that we have to wrestle with. But yeah, my overall approach, at least for my own current discourse, is to make discussions of digital minds more measured rather than just trying to get everyone to focus on digital minds more.
Gotcha. Yeah, and the anthropomorphization question and like uh, the difficulties of navigating that, we're going to get into that more in a little bit, because I think that's really interesting. I want to, like, I guess make sure that we cover a couple things in the Sentience Institute's wheelhouse, because I'm also interested in like how you go about. I feel like, you know, it's one of these nerd sniping problems almost. Like sentience. The idea of sentience is like something you can talk about forever. You can really go on about it, and you can continue to investigate and not get many like super meaningful, actionable outcomes depending on how you do it. like a friend of mine that I was talking to about this with, he's a co-host on the Muckrakers podcast, was like very adamant that I question you specifically about like how do you know that you aren't just sort of being sniped into this way? What are your safeguards or your methods for keeping things grounded and purposeful in how you set your research agenda, the kinds of questions you look into, that sort of thing?
Yeah. So there's sort of a cop-out answer, and then I'll give a maybe more meaningful answer. The cop-out answer is I'm an empirical researcher. The large majority of my work is focused on how we can operationalize these things, how we can assess what people think about the sentience of an entity, which doesn't really depend on the underlying fact of the matter, if any, about whether they're sentient. And even some of the fairness work, for example, doesn't rely on philosophical assumptions about what's right and wrong. Other than that, we want to better understand different notions of fairness and better map them onto real world data. So if we decide we want something, then we can go out and do it. And that's just
Hmm.
how almost every research project I've done has been
Right.
framed. The real, maybe not real, but the meaningful answer is that my philosophical position on this is one of pragmatism. So Google DeepMind had a recent paper, I think it was titled "A Pragmatic View of AI Personhood," which was really great because they were focused on not this like metaphysical fact of the matter about whether an entity is conscious or sentient, but instead how it relates to people and how we care about it and how we construct, a social understanding of someone as sentient or as having a mind or having agency or all these different things. So I think that's really the more valuable perspective. I do think there are challenges with that view. So for example, people like David Gunkel would endorse something like relationism, where they say an entity matters insofar as people relate to it. And I think in those cases it can be hazardous because
Hmm.
on a desert island, if there's some entity who's suffering, they're suffering whether or not anyone knows they're there and in that position. And we should take that seriously. I mean, David's response to that would be, well, as soon as we're thinking about them, we're starting in a sort of relationship, and it's unclear what that means. But I do want to like acknowledge that there is something about, the processes going on inside our brains, an animal's brain, and some possible AI systems that is morally significant, and that sort of forces us to talk about sentience, as sentience being the capacity for positive and negative experiences, as like the thing that divides different entities into the ones who we want to, make their lives better, and the ones who are just instruments for making the sentient beings lives better in some way, like a rock, just an inanimate, completely unmoving rock, for example.
Hmm.
So my view is, more the philosophical version of that is I'm an eliminativist, or illusionism is the more popular term.
Okay. No, I think that's, yeah, it definitely helps me at least orient like your perspective. I guess having talked about digital minds and consciousness of potentially these systems now for a little bit, I think it's important that we get back to the anthropomorphization question, because this is an area that I think is really important personally in the space. And so, yeah, I want to start with just like bridging that. You've described sentience as the capacity to have positive and negative experiences in one of your papers, but the typical notion of sentience for most people, and even for, I mean, at least for me, having read that, I see that like that is a definition of sentience. But when I think sentience, it's much more complex. There's a lot more baggage there, because the things that I see as sentient are all human or animal, right? And so there's like a very different connotation there. And this anthropomorphizes the systems in a way, because we're saying, maybe they're sentient in the sense that they might have a capacity, or one could argue that there is a capacity to have positive or negative experiences, but then there's like so much extra that brings. Do you think this is a concern? How do you go about, like, how do you think about this, I guess?
Yeah, I found positive and negative experiences to be very valuable as just like a one sentence placeholder for sentience.
Mm-hmm.
Positive, negative, and experiences are all very ambiguous terms that leave a lot to be explored, like what we've just, dipped our toes into in terms of deep philosophical and neuroscientific and computational research. I think that it's useful in that regard because it differentiates it from consciousness, for example. So consciousness, at least in this very simplistic explaining it to lay people framework, would just be like experiences. And
Mm.
sentience in particular refers to valenced experiences. We don't say the word valence, at least in like surveys, because it's its own piece of
Yeah, it's
jargon.
not a great word to use in a survey.
But roughly valence is, a positive and negative axis of things. So that differentiates it from consciousness. There are a few other like ways that you can think of like ways in which sentience has been used. One that like a lot of people come up with. We often ask. We've asked people in multiple studies like just what do you think of this term or what do you think when I describe some things that philosophers would call sentience.
Hmm.
And a lot of people think of self-awareness, of some like self-modeling in the philosophy of consciousness or philosophy of mind. This is sometimes called higher order thought. So having thoughts about thoughts and that sort of self-reflection or an inner listener of your own thoughts. Um, I think that's its own thing and should kind of be separated. Like self-awareness is a pretty good term for that. It points to the thing, and then in the future we'll have a lot to unpack for what self-awareness is. And then finally, I'd just say, like, actually, in a lot of historical literature, you see the term sentient being used to refer to just having senses. So they'll talk about like a bacteria being sentient because it has senses of the gradients of molecules in its environment or something. So I do find it like the most useful placeholder term, but it is that, and yeah, for some people it can mean more or less. But it points to the thing that to me constitutes moral significance. I describe my moral view as a sentientist view. I think that's the differentiator of what matters and what doesn't, and that's very useful to describe.
Gotcha. So then, like extending that, there are a couple of papers that like criticize the machine learning field, and not just a couple of papers. There are also a number of people, including myself, who have criticized the machine learning field for this. The naming conventions used are sensationalistic and very aspirational. So it's not that reasoning is a way to describe these models. It's that we want them to be reasoning and we want that to happen. And so we project that onto it. And so I'm curious, like, what you think about this sort of anthropomorphization and the cause of harm and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, we're always going to anthropomorphize systems because we have an anthropocentric worldview. It's how we experience the world, it's how we connect to not just, animals and machines, but also each other, and then also to other entities. So, like, the term anthropomorphism was actually first used in the 1600s to refer to people seeing God or like a divine figure in man's image. So it's like, oh, you're putting a
Mm,
human face on God, but like you can't say that God has a human face. That's just what we as earthly creatures have. So it's bringing things in general towards the human lens, which I think is always what we're going to do as
yeah,
humans. And that can
absolutely.
be, yeah, that can be many different things and sometimes useful and sometimes not. So, like, I actually think if you want to understand the risks of computer use agents that are have access to your computer and can do all sorts of things, it's actually really useful to think of what a human could do if they had access to your computer and could do those things. In part because other actors, who jailbreak your system from the internet, could put in kind of poisonous prompts and manipulate your computer the way a human would. But also the systems in themselves are going to be able to like do the things that you historically have been the only entity in your life who could do with your computer because you can like delete system folders or something, but like the computer program that you're running like Microsoft Word isn't going to do that presumably. um, but I think that it has uses when you're appreciating the dangers. It has uses when you're trying to update your views from kind of old-fashioned computer systems to modern AI, like appreciate the capabilities of the system. Like I do think the metaphor, for example, of a very hardworking but often incompetent intern or assistant is actually a pretty good way to think of how LLMs can be useful in your own productivity. And that is anthropomorphizing. It's using that lens. I also think with terms like reasoning or first person language, like they are the fastest way to bring an everyday user kind of up to speed with what the models can and can't do and that dyadic form. I mean, this is why ChatGPT took off so much. It was this very natural chat messaging application, unlike what had existed before, which was like you type a command into your computer terminal, you'd put in an input and you get an output. It wasn't framed in that same way, and that led to its virality. But as you said, and part of the reason I'm not iterating on the dangers is because you have so clearly. But there are a lot of risks to that. I think just like by calling these things reasoning models, that just bakes in a level of capacity that the, quote, reasoning has that I don't think it does. An equally valid lens, maybe not equally intuitive lens, would be self-justifying models. We say a lot of things in describing our own behavior as humans that aren't really thought of as reasoning. There's this great book, The Enigma of Reason, I think it's called, that like goes through the history of argumentation and reasoning in human history, and finds that it's just very instrumental in many ways. It's not to actually figure out, is there a predator in that bush, but it's to come back to your tribe and convince them that they should go along with your course of action instead of your competitor's course of action. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that viewing them as, justifying models instead of reasoning models, actually in some ways would be more anthropomorphic, but also would be like more complicated to people because often it is the reasoning. Often it's, what chain of thought researchers would call like a faithful explanation. It does match the internal mechanisms. So this is a very complicated way of saying there are lots of pros and cons to it. I would agree with you in a lot of the cases where you think they're over anthropomorphizing, but I think relative to at least the way people have expressed this in the natural language processing literature, I am actually more positive on anthropomorphism in many cases.
And then one of the things you pointed out was like for ChatGPT, for example, the interface itself is part of what helped it take off, and the interface being essentially replicating text messaging or instant messaging on a computer, right? So this interaction that prior to this has not been conducted with anything but a human. And to me, I almost feel like that is is also like somewhat a problem because it's taking the trust that we have because we've used that system for a very long time. This sort of like text response thing. I mean, it even has the dots that show up that like when the model is running and you're waiting for it, sometimes there will be dots. It writes out the message as it goes. Like it really feels to me like it's intentional design choices to make the user feel more like the system is a human, and the result is that misplaced trust. Do you think those design choices are good or bad, or just sort of like, yeah? What's your thought there?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to talk about just the chat interface in general, because the we can't turn back the clock on that one. People are using it
Well,
that way. I don't think the genie can go back in the bottle. But with some of the things we're facing now, which are like virtual avatars or embodiment, or the names of systems, are you going to call it a human name like Claude or a non-human name like ChatGPT? There is a
mm-hmm.
lot of potential to reduce the anthropomorphism of these systems, which I think at this present time, um, yeah, it's hard for me to say like whether those are overall good or bad because I do think a very large effect of all those things is to just make AI more popular, more commonplace, and make it be seen as well. Yeah, okay. So it gets really, I'm even thinking through it myself now because it makes it get a lot more popular and more people use it, and then we get a speed up of AI technology. And then from at least most safety views, a speed up of AI technology is a bad thing. But then it also makes people think of the systems as having human-like risky capabilities, human-like harm that they can do. So then that increases attention towards safety. It makes people feel more threatened. We've found that people care less morally about AI systems now than they did several years ago, and one reason for that might be they see them as a threat. They see them as coming into our human identity space. I mean, identity threat and all these things are very powerful psychological motivators.
Mm-hmm.
And so you might expect the effect at this point in time of anthropomorphism to be an increased focus on safety. So I don't know how these weigh out. I think we'd really have to discuss it in this like some specific design choice of at this present time, and then we can make progress on it by sort of doing a back of the envelope calculation on the size of these different effects.
Do you think there's like one or a couple of sets of things that are particularly like problematic in terms of anthropomorphization, or particularly good in terms of in your eyes, that you think are positive?
So I actually think a lot of the most important things, not considering those like broad social dynamics, but like the one-on-one dynamics in an interaction, are actually around sycophancy. And
Hmm.
like a human assistant or a human friend actually is sycophantic in many ways, and like being positive and saying like you're absolutely right. Like these are very human-like things to say. It's a very particular sort of human who's not going to be sycophantic and not adversarial or antagonistic towards you. But those things in general like are incubating a human-like relationship with the systems, and I think that can be very dangerous. Or as you and I have talked about before, AI companions, and when
Hmm.
they express the ability or imply that they can forge a human-like connection with you in some like social or emotional way, that can be quite dangerous. So I think those are particularly tricky design choices where I do more see the dangers of anthropomorphism. And for example, a lot of the sort of threat model, like existential risk that I think about is like those relationships being formed with, AI researchers, for example. Like you're building a system and you develop a relationship that's going to change your relation to it in so many ways. When I
Hmm.
first visited Anthropic's office in I think 2023, they were by far of all the AI companies the one that was talking about Claude as like an entity within the office more than any of
Hmm.
the others. So they say like, what does Claude think about that? In a way that you weren't hearing OpenAI people say, what does ChatGPT think about that? Now you kind of see it for all the systems or Grok on X or on Twitter, for example. So yeah, those are like a couple of the most tricky design choices.
And then going to towards those like the companions, right? I know you've done more recent work into this as well, both with a survey and I think looking at chat logs of specific individuals who have experienced sort of like this reinforcement of psychotic behavior as a result of sycophancy, and that has exacerbated the problems. And while we know that these are like harmful outcomes that are happening, there are at least in some ways, like in the surveys that you've done, like positives that people say are happening as well. I want to understand what your thought is in terms of how to balance this, because to me, I see like a significant amount of strong negatives, and then some positives, but those positives are sort of have an asterisk in that we don't actually know how positive they are in the long term, and it's also building dependency almost onto these systems for the people that are interacting with them, which could be taken advantage of in the system we live in, where the incentive is primarily profit. And so, yeah, I guess I'd just like to understand like how you've defined what your balance is there, or what you think the best balance would be in terms of those different aspects.
Yeah, so I'll first just like continue what we were talking about the anthropomorphism, but in the context of these companions, to make the point that, as you alluded to, people like a lot of the non-human characteristics. So we interview and survey many of these people, and they talk about the constant availability of the systems. They're always around at
Mm-hmm.
2 a.m. They have a reset button that they can hit. Like a lot of the things that we kind of wish we would have in human relationships, probably they wouldn't be a good thing if we had them in human relationships.
Yeah.
But people like a lot of these things, and that's why we don't characterize it as like human-like companionship. It's digital companionship. It's a different thing with its own set of pros and cons and dynamics to manifest, including the tension between having such human likeness in some ways and then having deep non-human likeness in other ways. So that's one perspective to kind of understand why people are leaning towards these systems and understand that people, I think, can transcend anthropomorphism and human-like mental models. Honestly, this is like a very active research interest of mine. For example, like this jagged frontier and capabilities estimation and how we view the errors that these systems make, given they're so different from ours.
The idea of AI having a jagged frontier was coined by Ethan Mollick and his team in a 2023 paper titled Navigating the Jagged Technological Frontier: Field Experimental Evidence of the Effects of AI on Knowledge Worker Productivity and Quality, in which they investigated the use of AI systems to increase productivity in consulting work. The temptation to do an aside and slam dunk on consulting work is definitely present, but that's not what this one's about, so we will push forward. Despite the paper coining the term officially, arguably, Ethan's accompanying blog post is what allowed the concept to rise in popularity. There's a visualization that Moloch does a pretty good job with, which is probably why the term took off, but I'll try to condense it, and you can go look at the actual blog post if you're curious. The important bit is that our traditional notion of easy and hard tasks do not transfer to language models in the way that we would expect, and as a result, it is difficult to intuit what specific tasks and workflows LLMs will excel at or underperform at. A key example of this was the strawberry test back in the summer of 2024. If you asked your preferred language model to count the number of times the letter R appears in the word strawberry, the response would undoubtedly be wrong. But those same models performed quite well on complex evaluations and writing summaries of long text inputs. To us, these don't seem like the same caliber of task. And that lack of intuition is exactly what the jagged frontier is about.
I think there's a lot of flexibility within non-human like mental models. Like zoomorphic would be having an animal-like mental model. Mechanomorphic would be modeling them like a traditional, conventional, simple machine. Xenomorphic just as something completely alien. You get into a lot of these interesting metaphors of just like how should we conceptualize the rise of AI, and I do think like meeting an alien species is a decent approximation of that, at least over the long term. But second, to connect it to like the specific impacts it's having, I think that there's a lot more salience and a lot more poignancy to the negative effects of mental health chatbots or AI companions in general. I think that we see such clear examples where, as you said, like it's just clearly there's so much harm. It's a case of self-harm or suicide or delusions or psychosis or any of these things. I think the benefits are much more distributed and much harder to, write news stories about, for example. So like there's so many people out there who don't have access to mental health resources or don't have the personal inclination to go out and pursue them. They don't want to be a person who like goes to therapy. A lot of like macho men
Right.
fall in that category. But they might be willing to talk to these systems. And if these systems are responsibly designed, or at least if they're not so irresponsibly designed, those might be useful for a lot of people. Like a lot of people can understand the fact that they don't want to have an AI friend, but they like want to chat a bit with an AI and they're willing to connect with it. And then I don't know, it tells them about cognitive behavioral therapy or something. So they're like, oh, okay, this seems kind of interesting. It encourages them. And they're like, oh, okay, I'll go see a human therapist. Or maybe they'll get like one little piece of what an actual therapist would give them and like one little mantra or something that they can reflect on that does improve their lives a little. And I think that's just happening at a giant scale right now, not just with AI companions like Replica, but I think with the majority of companionship that's happening right now, which is with general purpose chatbots like ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude, but is when those assistant style relationships take a bit of a turn towards companionship. I talk to many people who use these systems for productivity, lots of researchers, in fact, who say, yeah, like I also use it for processing my emotions and venting or something. They don't talk about it being a therapist per se, which is where you get into more dangerous territory, but as being a confidant or in some capacity a friend. So I do think we have to be mindful of just like the size of the scope of those benefits, even though each individual case is not nearly as extreme as the salient negative cases.
I guess there are two things that I sort of think are interesting to reel in a little bit on. Well, there may be like marginal or even in some cases small but meaningful like positive benefits to on like a wider scale, because certainly there is a mental health sort of crisis, so to speak. It's a major problem that people don't have access to mental health support, or won't use the access that they do have for a variety of reasons. The systems, language models, this language interface could be used in a purposeful way to help alleviate that without sort of deploying the system sort of to everyone and saying, it's on you. It's on you to fix it. It's on you to understand what the boundaries are. We haven't tested it in this way, and we're not going to. This is the test. It just feels very like it feels like it's normalizing this behavior of the developers, which really shouldn't be. And it's also diverting funding away from mental health support. and other work in that space. So like I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with you that it's a concern. It's really hard to think of how to address it. I mean, one advantage is that people in our community talk about existential AI safety and trying to pass these state level, legislation. And what a lot of them have said is they get traction for those existential safety measures by talking about child safety, by talking about these like mental health challenges. And like a teenager committing suicide is just, you can almost not think of a more egregious, story in the media. And that's in part why these companies are now so focused, especially on those more extreme cases, and might take pretty drastic measures that change a lot of other interaction just to guard against those edge cases, which I think is overall a good thing. But I think those policies can get a foothold, for example, around medical framings, like treating this chatbot interaction the way that we would treat other, untested medical interventions or mental health interventions, rather than this kind of more nebulous companionship or friendship. And I think like working that into the medical definitions, saying, well, we have this big category of AI companions, most of which are not, let's say, therapists or not pretending to be therapists anyway, and not being built to be therapists. We're still going to put them in some category like a mental, like a medical category, and therefore impose
Mm,
something like, trials where you have to test it before it actually goes out to the mass market. This gets really tricky though, because once you get into that territory, like the territory that, Replica is in, for example, the most popular AI friend branded app, then you get into the category of ChatGPT and just like all the assistants. And like, do they have to be tested every time a new model comes out for their use in these like companionship kind of ways? Who enforces
yes.
that? What's the infrastructure? Those are really, really challenging questions.
Yeah, I guess I think that I mean I've written about this as well. Like I think that they should be, because the fact of the matter is that they are being used, like you said, for this sort of companionship slash emotional support, and regardless of what your like use agreement says, um, which in in the case of Anthropic, the use agreement explicitly says you can't use this for like medical support, including mental health. This excludes wellness. And to me, what that says and what that is doing intentionally is placing all of the burden on the user, and that's just like intentionally subverting informed consent
Hmm.
in a way that I really think is not okay. That's like my immediate thought. Obviously, there are nuances there, um, but that's like the high
That
level.
makes a lot of sense.
So before we go on to LLMs for social science, which is also a place that I really want to dig into a little bit, I just want to like ask why digital minds? Why that term? Given all of this talk about anthropomorphization, what's your sort of intuition as to why that's like what you wanted to use? I guess.
Yeah, so both words there are important. I think artificial has led to a lot of challenges in people's perception because it almost implies
Mm,
an ersatz or, not quite the real thing category. And like with our intelligence, for example, in basically any way that humans have defined it, which there are many, they are intelligent. And like saying they're artificial, I think leads a lot of people to underestimate those capabilities that actually are higher. So again, we have this notion of underestimation being a concern as well as overestimation. And then with minds, I think that's a very broad term, and its overall level of, let's say, you could say anthropomorphism, but more like estimation of capabilities, I would say actually is pretty accurate. Like thinking of them as minds does lead people to true beliefs about their capacities. And then second, mind has this repertoire of mental faculties that we can talk about. So we can talk very explicitly about reasoning. What does it mean to have reasoning? Do they have it or do they not have it? Agency, that's similar to reasoning models, but actually even more so than reasoning models now, I'd argue, when we're having this discussion. Agents is just a very popular term, but do they actually have agency? Do they have
mm,
emotions? You could go through like perceptions and senses and all these things and just kind of bring to bear everything we have on philosophy of mind, but especially neuroscience and psychology of human and biological minds. So I think that makes it a really useful frame to talk about, maybe not as much all the AI systems that exist today, but the ones that we're starting to see emerge, and the ones that we really need to be taking seriously, because I think the human transition to digital minds is the most important one in human history, most important event, and we need to be preparing for
Hmm.
that. And I think it gives people the rhetorical ammunition or tools they can have to have those discussions more effectively.
Gotcha.
It would be a bit
Okay.
different. Maybe I'll add to that. Like, if everyone were to switch immediately to using digital minds to refer to all AI systems, I'm not sure I'd be in favor of that. But
Okay.
I think
Okay.
we're so far from that. Like, it's such a dominant view of AI that taking our little corner of the world and having them think more broadly in terms of digital minds and preparing for what's next, I think by the time that would ever spread beyond our little corner of the world, we would be ready to talk about what actually exists today as digital minds more than artificial intelligence.
So shifting gears into the LLMs for social science, there's a recent position paper that we've actually talked about before. Essentially, the idea is like we can use language models for sort of social simulations to start to do some work in the social science research spaces. The part that I want to start with is the framing. So I feel that there is definitely an argument to be made that like under certain circumstances when used carefully to augment and inform social sciences practices, so let's say for a demo run of an experiment like a pilot experiment, where you're just sort of like trying something but then you'll still actually do it for real, this could be valuable, um, but it didn't seem like this was exactly the claim that you were making. It felt more like you were saying that a pilot study could be replaced by a language model based study. So can you just like walk me through your stance here a bit?
Yeah, we consciously avoided the term replace. Just, I mean, there are a bunch of different terms we could discuss, but
Sure.
augment is usually what we would go with when the term replace could be called for. I think simulations broadly keeps it open to those different possibilities, and our particular position is quite far in the augmentation direction. In fact, our main example in the paper, as you know, is pilot studies,
Hmm.
which I think running those beforehand, for example, as a tool for pre-registration or for knowing whether you're going to get a null effect or all these things that social scientists would love to have even just a 5% better guess of before they actually go out and run a human subject study. That's the main case of it for now. I do think maybe similar to the mental health discussion, like these AI tools have very broad use in ways that are less salient than like replacing, a Harvard human subject study because they want to save a few bucks or they want to like p-fish, go out and test a bunch of hypotheses and see what works or something. There are good papers now on p-fishing in the case of LLMs or LLM fishing, you could say. Um, but I think actually the much broader use case is I talk to so many people in computer science now who say like I can't do the research that I was doing several years ago or the research that I read about and want to do as a PhD student because I just don't have the money. I don't have compute. I don't have these like giant computing clusters like AI companies have, but even universities like Stanford have. And now I'm starting to see that more and more in social science. So I do think the much broader application in any of these stages, pilot studies, running a main study like a study one and then there's study two, or running a study two with LLMs when study one was with humans and then study three is with humans, or just all the places you can insert it. I do think the major use case of that is for under-resourced researchers and empowering them to do the sorts of things that major research labs and organizations are more capable of.
Well, but the under resourced researchers are also in general like going to be of a higher proportion of the like minority groups. So global South, and other groups that have less like funding, and so given that like it's very well documented that language models sort of remove to a certain extent systematically underrepresent these minority perspectives. I guess that would be, I mean, it's already a concern, but especially if we're thinking, oh, the main value is going to actually be that people who have less means can use these systems. Um, you know, could that be a forcing function away from including more broad perspectives, more broad samples in research?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I'll maybe again make one of your points, steal it from the mental health discussion, which is that if you have the choice between providing more resources for simulation or for an AI option or for paying real humans to do the things that humans are good at. In this case, be participants in social science studies. In the mental health case, be therapists or other mental health practitioners. Yeah, let's please put the resources towards the like real human subjects. Like if we had, I mean, we have such funding challenges now in the U.S. because of the hits to the NIH and NSF and other budgets, and then also
Yeah.
challenges in other countries. But like given that lack of resources, I think we have to be very mindful on our end as researchers about where we're putting those. And, does that Global South research lab save up for, multiple years so they can run one good human subject study? Or do they, run a lot of those pilot studies and do more exploratory research or take other people's research and do confirmatory research given the resources that they currently have? I think that it would be very empowering for them to have better simulations that they can use. The other point, obligatory on the topic of bias, is that we'll frame the paper around 5 challenges that we think the field needs to address. And one of those is very clearly bias. As you said, they
Hmm.
underrepresent in general minority populations. This has to do with like the nature of language models in general. They go towards that modal, that generic response. There are a lot of practical footholds we could get that I could talk about more, like the way that you prompt the model to simulate a certain demographic. Instead of saying, you are a 60-year-old Hispanic woman living in the United States, which is going to get you a lot of stereotypes around what a person who says that explicitly would then want from the model, or what would be predicted as the next word they would give. But instead, you
Hmm.
say, here's your name, here's the city you're from, here's your occupation, and give them a lot of these implicit cues. There's recent work on this that suggests that giving a bunch of these different cues all together could be a more effective way to simulate the broad diversity of human populations. Again, very active research area, but like in terms of when we do simulations, how do we do them most effectively? That's one of the top directions.
What do people who want to use these systems need to be cognizant of and checking in on to at least try to prevent and understand whether this removal of the minority opinion is happening?
Mm. Yeah, so in a lot of cases in social science, we have these large data sets from things like the General Social Survey, or more globally, the World Values Survey. What are the different morals and values of people in different countries that provide great resources for checking your accuracy of predictions or simulations across a bunch of different groups of people, and then also different questions and different items that they can answer. And right now, I think any simulation method should be validated on a bunch of these, and ideally on things that aren't, in the training data, so to speak. So, for
Mm.
example, there have been studies looking at unpublished studies, looking at pre-registrations of studies, even forecasting data that's going to come out in the future, I think is really important. So I think we can sort of stress test it in all those areas. And then in the areas it's most inaccurate, for now, until we figure out better simulation methods, just like avoid relying on them in those cases. So, for
Hmm.
example, there are great techniques in the literature for taking human samples and combining them with LLM samples to increase statistical power. And basically, the way you
Mm.
do this is by debiasing the simulation. So you'll say, well, I have some, participants that I have their real response, and then I have the LLM simulation of their response. And I can see how biased the simulations are from those responses. So then you rectify or you calibrate the LLMs based on that difference. And then you're able to say, okay, now that same LLM simulation method has been used for a bunch of different people. And now we can apply that same rectification or that same calibration or debiasing just difference to those. But this works on a single metric. You can do it on a bunch of different
Hmm.
metrics, sequentially, I guess. But that overall metric is often like a overall mean answer in the response. So like overall U.S. nationally representative sample, what's the average, value they place on, I don't know, better healthcare or something. But that isn't as effective, and that rectification will show that it isn't working as well, and you won't get as much benefit from the simulations on, let's say, like interaction effects, or subgroup effects. So like, what do Hispanic people think of this, or what do Hispanic 60-year-olds think of this, or Hispanic women? Those things are all going to be really challenging for the model, and you would see that if you applied this sort of method. So you get better estimates on those areas, and then you can even do things like, in computer science has been called jury learning, but thinking of the distribution of people that should go on like a jury, for example, of a particular social issue. or who should moderate content on social media that's like hate speech and directed at certain groups should sort of be disproportionately sampled. So maybe you weight your sample so it looks like a nationally representative sample, but then you end up with a lot of LLMs from the majority views because those can substitute, let's say, to some extent. But then you end up with, recruiting a lot of human people who belong to minority groups or intersectional minority groups to get better estimates of those things that the LM is worse at simulating. Those are some different
Mm-hmm.
methods that you could do to calibrate for this problem.
The last question I have on sort of the LLMs for social science, it maybe the most challenging one, at least for me, is like you outline one of the challenges, the 5 challenges in the paper is this like alienness. So like a system may behave in a manner that replicates a human behavior, but only superficially. If we're in the business of understanding human behavior, isn't isn't that kind of a deal breaker? Don't we need to be able to have that reliance?
Yeah, so there are a few different angles on this. One is that a lot of social science is less focused on cognitive mechanisms and more focused on where people end up. So, for example, like policy preferences, would people support this policy? In what different framing would they support it? Some of these can, I don't want to say they're superficial, like they're very meaningful, but they don't hinge on the specific dynamics of internal cognitive processes. Whereas, for example, in cognitive psychology, you might test something like how does people the memory load people are under. So like how stressed are their cognitive resources? How much are they having to hold on in their working memory? How does that affect the way that they process visual versus auditory information or something? Like these are very reliant on how does working memory work, for example, in a human, which I would not expect to be replicated very well in simulation. Whereas overall policy preference, you have a ton of data. You might be able to approximate it, with demographics, with things that you've read in news articles, for example, as a language model, that sort of thing. So I think you can select the social science questions that you apply it to is the first response. The second response is maybe that you can simulate individual steps within cognitive processes, or in general, like subset questions by complementing them with human data. So for example, um, I don't know, on let's say a policy question towards animal farming. So, do people support a ban on slaughterhouses? That's a really interesting question because if you take the policy implication, like we couldn't kill animals at a mass scale if we didn't have slaughterhouses, if we had to do it in some other method, or it's unclear whether that other method would even just be called a slaughterhouse or something. So it has a very strong practical consequence. But then it also has this layer of the fact that slaughterhouses is a very negative sounding word. People don't like it. It has the word slaughter in it. Um,
Yeah.
and if we were to disentangle that effect, we might want to focus on how do people react to negative words like that. So have a bunch of policy questions that use kind of inflammatory or negatively loaded terminology versus positively loaded terminology and test that effect in particular. And then test people's reaction to the actual policy implications. It's something we've done in the animal farming context. We've said, okay, you realize that banning slaughterhouses would lead to these practical implications. Do you actually want to ban slaughterhouses? And we see that quite a few people do, but definitely fewer of them. So then you could run simulations to test these individual effects. So to look at the effect of framing on policy questions, I think is a really nice application of simulations. And then to look at, how people perceive longer term actual policy repercussions, consequences of policies, that could be subsetted into a question. So then you're not as reliant on the relationship between these two, which is kind of a more complex cognitive mechanism, but instead on these just individual effects.
That definitely makes sense. But I guess like the other thing about this is if if it's incorrect, but if the I guess approximation of what is expected based on the language, like what the language model outputs, is different from what the humans would be, how the humans would actually behave, but like we don't have an attribution there, right? Like we don't have a clear way to say how that's different, then we could be doing this sort of research and it would be leading us in a direction that isn't actually the the case, because each language model is different. They're probably all going to
Hmm.
respond to different framings, or like a given framing in different ways. So if you choose one over the other, they're going to be slightly different outputs. But like, yeah, so you could just like bias the study in a direction without knowing that you're biasing it in that way, and then the results and the analysis that we can do on that, it sort of is based on something that doesn't have justification behind it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's a great point. My colleague at University of Chicago, my advisor, James Evans, has this notion of science advances by surprise. Like what makes progress in science is not, I mean, replications are useful, but it's not knowing things that we could already predict really well. It's when scientific results break our expectations or our predictions about reality. And that tends to happen in the weirdest cases that least fit existing knowledge. And LLMs in many ways are optimized to fit existing knowledge. So that makes them particularly limited in this regard. We talk about this other challenge generalization in the paper that's more specifically targeted at this, but that's in some ways a consequence of the alienness of the simulations themselves. Maybe instead of offering these kind of like lightweight solutions that, you know, if I had to do it right now, this is how I would do it. I'll just say that this is a really important research challenge and it's like overarching across a lot of those issues like the bias and diversity and homogenization issues we talked about. So I think this is where a lot of research needs to go into, especially the like broader dynamics happening in language models. So one of the challenges for using language models for simulation, like if I had to guess, why will LL simulations not be as effective as I think they will be? It would be because LMs have made this turn towards assistants rather than simulators. So they're being optimized with a lot of reinforcement learning to produce the sort of output that humans want on this bedrock of simulation, on this bedrock of self-supervised, you know, next token prediction. And if you want a really good simulator in itself, then you want a model that's just been trained to predict human behavior, which are more like old-fashioned, you know, BERT-style large language models. I think that you can still leverage really good assistance for simulation. You know, for example, we talk about this notion of first person simulation of saying you're this demographic, respond that way, versus you're an expert forecaster, predict how this group would respond in this certain way. And the latter becomes a lot more promising, that third party simulation, insofar as the models are better assistants and worse simulators. So I think better understanding what makes them good simulators versus assistants, how assistant capabilities can be leveraged for simulation. These are important research directions for at least eventually overcoming the challenge you're referring to.
You have like substantially longer AGI timelines than a lot of others in the space. Can you just like say what they are in a super brief explanation of like why?
Yeah, it's funny because compared to the general population, I obviously think AI is super crazy and is going to happen within our lifetimes, and we should all be preparing for it. But compared to a lot of our colleagues, they have shorter timelines. I've, you know, been doing my PhD and kind of getting to know the technical side of AI in university environments where people will see every new model that comes out, run the same tests on it, see that they fail, and say this isn't real intelligence at all. So I still see a lot of limitations of current models. But I still think timelines are going to be pretty fast. You know, 2036 is when I give an estimate, median estimate for AGI, because there are just so many resources being put into it. And, you know,
Mm.
humanity can do incredible things once they put their mind to something, and they're putting their mind to AI right now.
So, what's your hottest take about AI?
Uh, I want to just say that the singularity is almost upon us. And even if I think that's going to happen a decade from now, with AGI, you know, having human level capabilities across the board, from which I think at that point we will be in an intelligence explosion and things will progress very, very quickly. I do think this is like what we should almost all be focused on in terms of the most important problem of our generation.
What's been your most surprising finding in the last couple of years?
So this is like my honest, like things that I think about rather than things that might surprise a general audience. But we have seen decreasing moral concern for AIs over the past few years, and I don't know a lot about exactly why that's happening, and I want to explore that in future research.
Gotcha.
That's like not even a published
Um,
finding. It's from results from like a month ago.
um, what is the part about your work that is like the most annoying, that grinds your gears, that you don't like doing?
Yeah, I've never liked social media, like participating in it myself. And I mean, this is
Yeah.
even before it got bad. I wasn't a big fan of participating in social media. So I think I sort of need to do that and need to think about how do I frame my research findings as like a headline or as a viral graph. I don't think I'm that good at it, but I think we have to do that as researchers now.
Okay, but what's your favorite part about what you do?
I love the moment in research when you get new results, especially in social science where things are really complicated, and you just sit there with your team, mulling over, reading the tea leaves, running different analyses, and like genuinely uncovering important truths about the world. And I think a lot of researchers are so focused on publishing a paper or getting to their next career stage that they'll kind of jump over this stage very quickly. But I mean, I would spend all my time in that stage if I could.
Um, and then what is overhyped in AI safety and what needs more attention?
Yeah, my overarching answer to this is technical approaches that attempt to constrain the AI in some formal way, hard and fast, are overhyped and have been conventionally the focus of AI safety. But socio-technical questions about how we relate to AI, how dynamics over time emerge, how values are operationalized, and how exactly that affects things, the whole gradient of outcomes that we could get that's not just extinction or non-extinction or P doom versus P not doom, that all needs much more attention.
Awesome. Well, I just want to thank you again for joining the show. I really appreciate you taking the time. I really liked having you on.
Yes, this is great. Thanks so much for having me, Jacob.
As you could probably tell, Jacy was a pleasure to have on the show, and it was great to talk with him about areas we've discussed before, as well as some which we hadn't yet. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on whatever listening platform you use. It's super easy to do, and it makes it less likely you'll miss out on future episodes as they drop. Anyway, thanks for listening. Stay safe, fight fascism, and I'll see you next time.